On the evening of August 14th, 2026, Donald Trump stood in front of a crowd in New York, campaigning for Republican midterm candidates, and told supporters something that made headlines across the region within the hour. After we finish defeating Iran, which is being very badly defeated, pretty soon I'll be declaring the Hormuz Strait a territory of the United States. He said it with a chuckle. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, responded within hours on social media, framing Trump's own words back at him with open sarcasm. The following day, a bulk carrier was struck by an unidentified projectile transiting the strait near Qumzar, Oman. One more entry in a string of attacks on commercial shipping that has continued despite months of American military presence in the Gulf. A Quinnipiac poll from late July had already found that 60% of American voters opposed continued U.S. military action against Iran. Trump's declaration wasn't made from a position where the underlying war had been resolved. It was made nearly 6 months into a conflict that remains unpopular at home and unresolved on the water, at a campaign rally about territory the United States does not currently control and has never controlled. That kind of statement is worth taking seriously, not for what it promises, but for what it reveals about the pressure building underneath it. And the clearest evidence of that pressure isn't in the strait at all. It's in a currency intervention that happened 2 weeks earlier, on the other side of the world, and that has received a fraction of the attention it deserves. On July 30th, Japan's Ministry of Finance conducted a solo currency intervention, buying an estimated 8.45 trillion yen, roughly $53 billion, in a single day, the largest one-day intervention in Japan's history, in an attempt to halt the yen's slide toward a 40-year low near 163 to the dollar. It didn't hold on its own. The next day, at a cabinet meeting at Camp David, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was photographed with a notepad reading, in his own handwriting, "To do, buy Japanese yen $5 to $10 billion." The photo wasn't an accident of a candid camera angle. It was captured clearly enough, at a moment deliberate enough, that markets read it as an intentional signal. Bessent confirmed shortly after that the United States had joined Japan's intervention, the first coordinated U.S.-Japan yen-buying operation since 1998. The yen jumped from near 163 to as strong as 155 against the dollar. By August 10th, it had given back roughly half that gain, sliding back past 159. The mechanics of how Washington executed that rescue are the part of this story that actually explains the pressure Trump's Hormuz comments are responding to. The Treasury didn't sell dollars to buy yen. That would have undercut Bessent's own strong dollar positioning. It didn't sell Treasury bonds either, which would have pushed up American borrowing costs at the worst possible moment. Instead, the Treasury drew on its exchange stabilization fund and sold euro-denominated holdings to fund the yen purchase, a fund that held roughly $217 billion in total assets as of the end of June. Bessent later described the choice to European counterparts as a straightforward reallocation, reflecting the fund's existing composition. The European Central Bank, according to reporting from the period, learned about the trade only after the New York Fed had already executed it, breaking a decades-old pattern of advanced mutual consultation between Western central banks on exactly this kind of operation. On August 14th, the same day as Trump's Hormuz comments, Senator Elizabeth Warren sent Bessent a formal letter, since confirmed by Japanese press coverage, pressing him to explain the intervention's cost, its use of the ESF, and its potential exposure for American taxpayers and financial stability. Why would the United States go to these lengths, using an unconventional funding mechanism and bypassing its own normal diplomatic protocol with Europe, to defend a foreign currency in the middle of an active war? The answer sits in a fact Bessent himself has raised publicly. Japan is the largest single foreign holder of U.S. Treasury debt, holding more than $1.1 trillion. A currency in freefall creates pressure on the country experiencing it to raise dollars by selling foreign assets. And for Japan, its enormous treasury holdings are the most liquid asset available for exactly that purpose. If Japan had been forced to sell treasuries at scale to defend the yen, that selling pressure would have pushed up U.S. borrowing costs at a moment when the American government is already running a substantial deficit and financing an expensive, open-ended military campaign. Bessent's own subsequent push asking the Federal Reserve to expand a lending facility called the FEMA repo facility so Japan could raise dollars against its treasury holdings as collateral rather than selling them outright, makes the underlying concern explicit. The United States wanted Japan to have dollars without Japan actually offloading American debt onto the market. This wasn't simply an act of alliance goodwill extended outward. It was, in significant part, a defensive maneuver to protect the American bond market from a shock originating in an ally's currency crisis. That crisis, in turn, connects directly back to the war in the Gulf, even though the two stories were covered almost entirely separately in most outlets. Japan imports the overwhelming majority of its crude oil, and a large share of it has historically moved through the Strait of Hormuz. Sustained disruption to that route, layered on top of an interest rate differential between the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Japan that had already been pressuring the yen for years, compounded a currency slide that was already underway before this war began. The Iran conflict didn't single-handedly cause the yen's weakness. Economists cited in coverage of the intervention pointed to longer-running structural factors, including Japan's government debt levels and demographic pressures. But the energy cost shock from a contested Hormuz added real additional strain onto a currency already testing historic lows. Washington's blockade strategy, aimed at squeezing Iran, produced a second-order effect that ended up requiring an emergency rescue operation for one of America's own most important economic partners. None of this happened in isolation from Japan's broader security position, which has been under strain from multiple directions this year in ways that compound the currency story rather than sit apart from it. Japan's relationship with China has been openly tense since Tokyo's government signaled, in parliamentary statements in late 2025, that a Chinese move against Taiwan could constitute a situation threatening Japan's own survival, triggering the legal basis for Japanese self-defense forces to respond collectively. China's response leaned economic rather than military, tightening controls on rare earth exports to Japan, a country that depends heavily on Chinese supply for materials used in everything from semiconductor fabrication to defense manufacturing, alongside restrictions on Japanese seafood imports and flight cancellations. Those measures function as leverage precisely because Japan's own rearmament program, including the Tomahawk missile purchases and expanded self-defense posture Tokyo has pursued as part of its alliance commitments, depends on exactly the kind of supply chains China has shown a willingness to constrain. It's worth being fair to the argument that this is simply ordinary alliance management, not evidence of an American system under unusual strain. Currency interventions between allies aren't unprecedented. The US and Japan coordinated support for the yen after the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, and periodic joint action to manage disorderly currency moves has real historical precedent. Besant has been explicit and public about the reasoning, not defensive about it, and Japan's own finance ministry has confirmed it welcomes continued coordination and remains in close contact with Washington. None of the currency mechanics described above were hidden. They were reported on, debated by economists like Kenneth Rogoff and Barry Eichengreen in real time, and defended candidly by the Treasury Secretary in television interviews. A transparent, publicly explained intervention conducted through legal Treasury mechanisms is a fundamentally different thing from a covert or coercive extraction, and treating every act of allied financial coordination as evidence of hidden strain risks reading intention into what may simply be competent crisis management between two governments with obviously aligned interests in a stable yen. What that more benign reading has to account for, though, is the scale and novelty of what actually happened. This was the first joint US-Japan yen intervention since 1998, a 28-year gap, undertaken using an unconventional funding source specifically chosen to avoid the two more obvious tools, dollar sales and treasury sales, that would have created visible domestic costs for Washington. It required breaking with the established practice of pre-notifying the European Central Bank before deploying euro-denominated reserves, a break serious enough to draw formal, on-the-record Senate scrutiny within 2 weeks. And it happened during, not separate from, an active and costly war whose own energy market disruption was a documented contributor to the currency pressure being addressed. Ordinary alliance management doesn't typically require this combination of unusual funding mechanics, procedural breaks with a G7 partner, and immediate cross-party political scrutiny at home. The intervention may well have been the right call under the circumstances. Besant's team clearly believed a stable yen served core American financial interests, not just Japanese ones. But the specific way it had to be executed says something honest about how many of Washington's normal, lower-friction options were already off the table by the time this decision needed to be made. Where this leaves the broader picture, 2 weeks after the intervention and 1 day after Trump's Hormuz remarks, is a genuinely open question rather than a settled verdict. What's documented is this: a war in the Gulf that remains unresolved and unpopular at home, a currency rescue for America's largest creditor that required breaking with established diplomatic protocol and drew immediate bipartisan adjacent scrutiny, and a president using increasingly maximalist rhetoric about territory the United States doesn't control at a campaign rally, while the underlying military and financial situation shows no clean resolution in sight. Whether the yen stabilizes, whether Japan draws further on the FEMA facility rather than risking more treasury sales, and whether the Hormuz War reaches any negotiated conclusion before the pressure on all of these fronts compounds further, are the things actually worth tracking in the weeks ahead, considerably more than whether Washington ever follows through on a rally stage claim to a waterway it has never administered.